Greetings and salutations, everyone. Today we're going to take a look at the beginning of English America, the colonization of the American colonies by the British Empire, and what that would largely entail. So, let's get started. In Europe during this time, rivalry was a constant theme. We see that France and England had both claimed real large areas of North America thanks to earlier explorers in the late 16th century, Verrazano and John Cabot respectively. Spain starts to dominate throughout the New World for a couple of reasons. The first is that they had more domestic tranquility. They were not at war during this time. They were not fighting for religious upheaval or for fighting their neighbors even as much as France and England were. During this time in England, for example, the Protestant Reformation had gone on. The British monarch under Henry VIII had taken England from Catholicism to Protestantism. His daughter Mary had taken it back to Catholicism, and under Mary's successor Elizabeth, it had gone back to Protestantism. This is a lot to happen, and it's going to keep you very internally focused with less reason to expand and look outward. Second reason for Spain's big domination is they controlled areas that made them a lot of money real quickly. This was in exporting of goods, whether it be sugar, tobacco, coffee, and gold and silver. And those last two are by far the big money makers that Spain is going to be making. During this time, Spain is also going to dominate under the monarchy of Charles V, depicted here. See, during this time, he was both the King of Spain and the Holy Roman Emperor, which is essentially modern-day Germany. So you've got one monarch who's controlling two of the largest, most powerful, richest nations in Europe, and that's going to set his forces apart from everyone else. But Spain is not at the top of their game forever. After Charles, we see a real weak set of monarchs, especially Philip II. The Holy Roman Empire will not survive the Protestant Reformation. After Luther's Reformation and the Treaty of Westphalia, the individual German principalities are going to be allowed to choose their own religion, which weakens the power of an overall monarch by a lot. Spain's court was notoriously corrupt. You could buy your way in, you could kill your way in. It was not good stuff. Spain gets involved in a couple of other skirmishes and in some cases full-on religious wars, mounting them to owe a lot of money. But the biggest thing that happens for Spain is the Spanish Armada loss in 1588. Spain's invincible armada, their unstoppable navy, went to war against England with the goal of removing Queen Elizabeth from the throne. Now, if you were a betting person, you were probably going to bet on Spain. It was not called the Invincible Armada for no good reason. Due to bad weather, bad tactics, and some amazing amounts of dumb luck, the English win the day, and Spain's naval invincibility, autonomy, is going to be ruined from this point forward. They are never going to be the powerhouse they had been before this point. England was slow to get started for a couple of other reasons entirely. Throughout the 15th century, a series of wars, internal struggles for the throne had been going on. These were the War of the Roses, in which who is going to ultimately be in charge of England? Who is the ruling monarchy family? Will it be the Tudors or the Plantagenets? And following that conflict, when the Tudors win, they go through their Protestant Reformation, which I just talked of. Even winning against the Spanish did not mean they were automatically the most powerful nation state in Western Europe. From 1588 to some of their first colonies, there's some struggles that happen. As a colonial power, England didn't learn how to become a power from sending ships to the Americas and establishing the 13 colonies there. England first learned to be a colonial power in dealing with Ireland. Now, Ireland did not move to Protestantism the same way that most of the rest of the United Kingdom had, and maintained Catholicism and wanted to maintain autonomy for this. So the British government would, over various different times, attempt to conquer Ireland, sending in a military to kill people, to take the land, to bring the population in line. And yes, that means rather authoritarian, duplicitous means. One of the methods that England tried to use to bring Ireland to heel was the plantation system, the goal of just transplanting British people to Ireland, bring their Protestant faith with them, and the hope was, over time, the British would dominate Ireland and the Irish would just adopt this new way of things. And this, as you can imagine, was not super popular either. And it really does harken to the idea that this area, England and Ireland, as two separate nations and the same nation, it got complicated. For a lot of reasons, the Americas appealed to the British, and that might be predominantly because of the opportunity that existed here. Since the Middle Ages, you could farm on someone else's land, a noble lord's land, a landed lord, and in exchange for farming on that land, you had to give that landed lord a certain percentage of what you harvest, but you get to keep the lion's share of it. During the 16th century, the enclosure movement happens, and landowners and landlords, they start fencing off their own lands and say, okay, this is mine, you can't farm here at all anymore. And for people who had been farming in a certain region for generations, this was unacceptable. All at once, people are finding themselves living way below the poverty line, and in some cases will continue to do so for the next few centuries. And by comparison, the Americas represented the untapped potential for owning your own land. And this is huge. Not renting someone's land, not working someone's land, having your own land. This was a thing that in parts of Western Europe is equated to nobility has this. You don't. You are a peasant. You are a commoner. You are 90% of the population, and you will never own this. But in the Americas, you could. The New World was this wonderful utopia where you could live and work for yourself. Working for wages, working to earn a paycheck, working for hourly. In England at this time, this was equitable to servitude, and some people, they looked at it as bondage. During this time from 1550, in 1550, the population of England was 3 million. In only 50 years, it jumped another million people. The population increased by a third in only 50 years. Cities are cramped, jobs are few and far between, and the wage is bad. Couple that with the concept of primogeniture, which says the oldest son inherits everything. And decides how to divide it up. And if you are in a family of 2 or 3, yeah, there's a pretty good chance you're going to get something out of the inheritance. But if you are part of a large family and that family has largely survived to adulthood or even adolescence, you're not going to wind up with as much. So going to the Americas was the start of something new. Between 1607 and 1700, we'll see 500,000 people will leave England going somewhere. 180,000 are going to go to the West Indies. 120,000 are going to go to the Chesapeake area, but we'll think Virginia in this concept. And 21,000 are going to go to New England, and another 23,000 will go to New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania, respectively. There's tons of people who are leaving, who are going somewhere. Initially, yeah, we're looking at like a couple hundred folks here and there. But as the years go on and things get better, these numbers continue to increase. There are 3 types of colonies that will be established in the Americas. You've got your royal colony, which is where the king chooses who is going to lead it, whether it's a governor or a collection of councilmen, draws out a line and says, okay, this is the colony, go make it happen. And they do. And those individuals report to the king, they work for the king, and the king gets a chunk of all the profits. And it is understood that this land is royal land. It belongs to His Majesty. Then you have a proprietary colony. This is where one person, or sometimes a couple people, are given a large tract of land and said, okay, go make it happen, go manage it. Now, in a proprietary colony, the person who is leading the colony is rather autonomous. They get to choose how much land to divide up, how to sell it, and they don't necessarily have to do what the king says. They understand that the king and Parliament even might have said, okay, this is your land, this is your area, but they also have a little more autonomy than the royal colonies. The final group is going to be your joint stock and your company colonies. The Dutch were really good at this. This was a business where you set up just to trade, just to make money, just to expand, and that really is it, do business. This is where you're going to see a lot of money being made pretty quickly. And as opposed to proprietary and royal colonies, this also has the benefit of being even more autonomous. Now, reaching the joint stock company doesn't mean that you are fully autonomous, because usually you have to have a lot of money to get this started, and you have to be making money for the company to stay in power. But if those 2 things are happening, you are gonna be allowed to operate how you see fit. Some of our first joint stock companies that the British are going to put forward, their goal is to find the Northwest Passage. The idea that you could still sail by water, head west, and reach Asia. Unfortunately, none of them worked. There were some big discoveries that were made. Hudson would get to the Hudson River, Hudson Bay, Nova Scotia, Newfoundland. All of this area is mapped out during this time. However, no magic route to Asia ever happened. You can't sail north around Canada and get to Asia. Well, okay, you can. It's just so fantastically difficult, it's not worth it. Some of the first colonies that we see established, they do not last. 1583 is the first real English colony that's going to come into existence in North America, Newfoundland. It does not last. It doesn't have the people, the resources, and it just fails. And unfortunately, that's the kind of thing that can happen. These systems can fail. Sir Walter Raleigh's Roanoke colony was also failed. It was pretty much doomed from the beginning. They landed with enough supplies and enough food. Then they start running out of supplies. Then they start running out of food. Walter Raleigh leaves saying, I'm going to come back in the spring. I'll bring with me more men, more supplies, more food. Just last the winter, you'll be fine. He comes back, everyone's gone, the colony is deserted. The mystery of the Roanoke colony is one that continues to this day. Scrawled on in the colony was the word Croatoan. It is believed that is a reference to one of the native tribes. However, whether that was, oh no, we are being attacked by them, or hey, we have left to go live with them, we don't know. And none of the colonists were ever found again. So, ooh, spooky. Our big first successful colony is going to be Jamestown. 1607, it is established, and its initial goal is to make money. For the British, they had seen the Spanish and the Portuguese making tons of cash in their respective colonies in Latin America and South America. And the belief was England needed to get in on this game, that they were already 100 years behind the Spanish and Portuguese colonies. And this region was not explored, expanded upon, or exploited. Therefore, the British felt they were going to be able to do so. And as we've said, the idea of freedom for folks to come here was really enticing. The ability to be not bound by wage, not bound by land constraints, was an extremely attractive idea. This model of the early Jamestown fort or colony shows that it really was meant to be divided on all sides. You could defend it from a couple of different positions if you needed to. The colonists knew that they were landing on someone else's territory, and that sooner or later they were going to interact with the Native Americans. The colony established in 1607's goal was finding gold. It was widely believed that there was gold all over the Americas. And the fact that Spain had made so much money finding gold, harvesting gold, mining gold, and stealing gold gave the idea that, it's got to be everywhere over there. So a lot of the early colonists, they come looking for gold. They come with chemical tests for gold, and they think this is what we're going to do, and that's their priority initially over farming. And, making money is great, but at the end of the day, you can't eat gold. And if you're on the frontier and you're not growing food, you're going to be getting hungry pretty quick. This starts radically changing under the governorship of John Smith. And when he came in 1608, he made a couple very large changes to the colony. First was the idea that the old social systems, they no longer apply here. It doesn't matter if you came from England and were rich and were powerful and had it all going on. If you don't work, you don't eat. That's what it was. He understood that he needed to maintain good relations with the natives because in the Chesapeake Bay, they were the power. The Powhatan Confederacy was comprised of 30 different tribes, 25,000 individual Native Americans, and when you compare that to a colony of a couple of hundred people, with a fort made of wooden sticks, Smith knew that this was what had to happen. In 1610, John Smith was captured by Powhatan, and some say that this was a staged event where the Native Americans showed their authority in a attempted even execution of John Smith, and then at the last minute, the principal chief's favorite daughter, Pocahontas, throws himself on John Smith. No, father, don't kill him. And everything is, oh, okay, fine, we won't. We'll show mercy and we'll be the good guys. And that might have cemented, and that was going to have cemented these two groups together. Now, whether that was planned or whether that's just kind of what happened, that's kind of up to the philosopher. Unfortunately, Smith is wounded in 1610. He becomes very sick, and he has to go back to England to try to recover from this. And afterwards, the Native Americans and the colonists, they just clash and clash and clash, and it does not go well. The winter of 1609 and 1610 was known as the starving time. It was a very harsh winter. Of the 400 colonists who were in Jamestown at this time, 340 of them will die. There's even a documented case of a man who was planning on eating his deceased wife, and the people of Jamestown executed him by fire because, yikes. But that's how crazy things were. In 1610, we see that the replacement for Smith arrives. De La Warr shows up, and he brings with him a couple of hundred new people, tons of new supplies, food, seeds, all this stuff, and sets a precedent about new laws, establishing we need further order in this society. When Smith came in, he established a military-style regime. When De Warr comes in, he establishes a more religious, succinct idea that laws about church, laws against sodomy, laws against adultery were going to stand. He believed that with morality, the state would exist and society could survive. In 1612, John Rolfe is able to bring to Jamestown something that really changed everything, and that's going to be cold climate tobacco. Now, tobacco on its own grows in tropical weather, and you might not think of Virginia as cold climate, but in the same way you might think of like Canada as cold climate, but it gets cold, and it gets cold enough that this tropical plant cannot survive. This breed of tobacco can. Now, the crazy thing is we don't know exactly where Rolfe got it from. There's theories that say he smuggled it out of a fortress in Latin America, or that he stole a tree in Spain, or not a tree, a seedlings. The punishment for doing so at this time was death. So the stakes were high, but this changed everything because Spain had the monopoly on tobacco, on the entire production of this thing. And with it being grown outside of Spain, outside of the Spanish colonies, Rolfe, and by extension Jamestown, turned this into a cash crop and start making tons of money. They never found the gold that they wanted, but they do start making money in trade of tobacco. Perhaps the biggest difference between Spain, France, and England is that England will send entire families to the Americas, including children. The purpose of this was we want a society that's going to be there, that's going to create a generational presence in the colonies. Sure, we can send men to go and create haciendas, to create empires. We can send men to go be trappers and fur traders. But in a generation, those people are going to die, and if we don't replace them, then that's just it. Getting to the Americas, as opportunistic as it was, and as enticing as it was not an automatic thing. The big thing that kept people from coming here initially was getting here. The fact that you need to pay for your trip across the Atlantic. You need to pay for about a 5 to 6 week boat ride and all your food and your water for that entire time period. And you need to have enough set aside so that when you land, you have a place to start building your home. Most people do not have that kind of money. It's a reality of the situation. So the indentured servant system came into existence. This was a system where you would enter into bondage for a period of time between 5 and 7 years. You agree to work for someone else. That person will pay your way across the Atlantic, give you food, give you water. You work specifically for that person doing what is outlined in your contract. If he contractually says you are going to work my land, then you're going to work his land for the next 5 or 7 years. If he has cattle, you're going to be taking care of the cows. If it's housework, you're going to be a servant for that time period. What's outlined in the contract is it. At the end of it, then you're free, and congratulations, you now have paid off your debt to travel across the Atlantic. You now have a residence in the Americas. You had to give that time up, but now you can do whatever you want with the rest of your life. And this was extremely enticing, but it was still extremely dangerous. About half the people who sign an indentured contract do not survive the 7 years that it takes. And this creates a need to bring more people in. So for a long time, the indentured servant system was pretty self-fulfilling. In 1619, there is a new thing that happens, which was very surprising. A pirate ship had seized a Dutch ship that was carrying slaves to the Americas. The pirates basically just bring these slaves to Jamestown and offer to trade them. And this was really surprising because human slaves sold for quite a bit of money. During this time, it would be the equivalent of about $20,000 to $40,000 per person. So bringing 20 people for these pirates, this was payday for them. And yes, they viewed that as money. They didn't even view the fact that slavery is unethical as a thing. When the slaves were offloaded in Jamestown, the English there didn't have a law against slavery, but they also didn't have laws for slavery. So these individuals were just entered into indentured servitude contracts, and at the end of it, some of them were free, some of them weren't. Some of them would go on to be free and own more slaves and large tracts of land. Aside from entering into these labor systems willingly, there were also systems like the crimp system, which was basically where you could be kidnapped in England if you were a vagrant, if you were poor, if you were not working, taken aboard a ship, and congratulations, you are now entered into bondage in the Americas. Or even convicts, prisons, and if you committed a crime, you could be sent to the Americas under an indentured servant contract, and that's it. You've just been banished. Infamously, there was a kid in London who kept sneaking into Buckingham Palace, and he had been caught on 3 separate occasions in the royal palace. On one time, he was found sitting on the throne wearing the crown of England, and at that point, the British monarchy had like, oh, we got to get rid of this guy, and the justice system had already imprisoned him on several different occasions for doing this, but he kept doing it. So they just, all right, fine, you're off to the Americas, and that's what happened. The idea of going, even with entering into bondage for years and half of people are going to die, that sounds really scary. But again, the idea of owning land and freedom was that enticing. In the British political system, if you don't own land, you don't vote. You don't have a say in the government at all. You are just there. So this was your way out. The Spanish and the French viewed the Native Americans with the idea that, okay, we're never going to get rid of all of them. Let's just live with them. Let's intermarry them. For the Spanish, the casta system even created lines and degrees of intermixing. Not the British. The British thought, we're just going to take the land and push the natives off the land. And by and large, intermixing was not accepted. One of the most famous marriages that was between the 2 different groups was between Pocahontas, the favored chief of the Powhatans, and John Rolfe, the guy who brought the tobacco. And this was famous and very unique, and near the end of her life, Pocahontas even went to England, and people were just like, oh my goodness, a Native American, and it was just the talk of the town. Land was gained from Native Americans through a couple of different ways. Sometimes there was the, okay, here's a war, okay, the natives lose, okay, so the settlers take more of it. Sometimes there's a treaty, sometimes there's a purchase, but in the end, the displacement continued to happen. And being displaced, being kicked off your own land, that was hugely transformative, but it was not the only transformative thing that happened for Native Americans. New things start arriving with the Europeans. The metals, for example, firearms. The person who's going to buy from you now wants to give you money instead of an equitable trade of a thing. Alcohol showing up really changes things because, as we have said before, fermented wheat didn't exist in this part of the world prior to European arrival, so there's no natural resistance to it, which means it's easier to become intoxicated and easier to become addicted. Native fields are taken usually for cattle and pigs, and those are again things that didn't exist in this region prior to Europeans bringing them. Forests are cut down for lumber for these new settlements. So this expansion of colonial forces transforms native life significantly and will continue to do so forever. So today we took a look at England's beginnings of colonies in the Americas. Hope you learned something today. I'll see you next time.